Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. This is a presentation on the LGBTQ history in the United States. The history of the United States has been painted black and white within its education system. In the textbooks taught to Americans, it illustrates the country's history from one perspective, utilizing sharp and defined lines, but never the murky shades of gray in between, nor looking at the same history from different eyes. How many citizens have heard of William Dorsey Swann, an African American that was born into slavery but became the first American to become a queen of drag? Or of Gladys Bentley, a famous African American singer during the Harlem Renaissance that left her crowd speechless with her voice and piano skills, alongside her cross-dressing and lesbianism. These are icons and historical figures never taught within the regular school curriculum. Just like the origins of history anywhere around the world, LGBTQ history has existed as long as the human race did. Today, this presentation will cover LGBTQ history and events in the United States from the 1990s to present day. Certain historical events from queer history prior to the 90s are most likely to be known by the common American today. Stonewall rings in the ears of those who know about it and have lived through it. In the 1960s, alongside the rise of African American justice and freedoms, rose LGBTQ freedoms and justices. Mimicking the tales told by African Americans, queer Americans were barged in upon at gatherings and imprisoned for human indecency. Gay bars across the country were ransacked and the patrons arrested without just cause. With the rise of African American voices, the LGBTQ community took note of the many protesting tactics and resisted, ultimately leading to the first ever Pride Parade in New York. Stonewall is the name that identifies these nationwide protests over the weekend, the protest that started from the patrons of Stonewall Inn. It's events like these that bring America to where it is today, but it's also important to note that LGBTQ history is intersectional with other histories. Dr. Andrew Weibel, a philosophy and LGBTQ history professor at Muskegon Community College, said that one of the many examples of this intersectionality are the Stonewall riots. African Americans and LGBTQ people do not exist separately in two different spheres. The two marginalized groups overlap, and the same is with other groups in society as well. This is a key concept that needs to be carried throughout this presentation, and outside of it as well. 1981. The AIDS pandemic began with only a few people infected. Time continued and it rapidly spread, but information on the virus was little. It was not until 1983 that the US government began funding for research for a vaccine, and in 1985 a vaccine was finally created. By 1985, over 12,000 citizens have died. Although it was nicknamed the gay disease and other names, it infected more than just gay-identifying men. AIDS and HIV killed children and adults of all kinds. Over the 1980s, some of those helping to treat patients with AIDS were evicted from their apartments. Those with the virus were denied job opportunities and even rejected from attending middle and high schools. This led to the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. This act prohibited discrimination against those with disabilities, including those with AIDS and HIV. In 1994, AIDS became the leading cause of death for all Americans ages 25 to 44. In the late 1990s and 2000s, cases began to decrease as research and treatments improved. As of June 5, 2021, it has been 40 years since the first 5 cases of AIDS. In 1990, immigrants that were a part of the LGBTQ community were allowed to enter the country. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 originally prohibited queer immigrants from coming to America, even after being queer was no longer considered a mental illness in 1973. 1990 marked a monumental year for immigrants. 1994. The policy nicknamed Don't Ask, Don't Tell was put into place. This policy prohibited LGBTQ communities to serve in the military openly. Because of this policy, over 14,000 service members were discharged over the course of the years it was in place. President Barack Obama repealed this policy in 2011. 1996. Colorado added an amendment to its state constitution that stripped persons of protection against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. The Supreme Court examined and challenged this amendment, ultimately laying down the law of the land and declaring it unconstitutional. The next key milestone in LGBTQ history comes from the court case Lawrence v. Texas, but in order to understand the case, one must visit Bowers v. Hardwick. Taking place in Georgia in 1986, Michael Hardwick was arrested on the count of engaging in illegal sodomy. In other words, Hardwick was caught in the bedroom of his home with his lover engaging in sexual activities. Hardwick made the argument that Georgia was criminalizing consensual sodomy, but the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Georgia, making any sexual activities between same-sex couples illegal. That takes us into the 2000s. Lawrence v. Texas overruled this decision in 2003. John Lawrence was arrested for engaging in deviant sexual intercourse with his partner. The court considered Bowers v. Hardwick, and the held decision was that criminalizing sexual conduct violates the Due Process Clause per Pro 3 through 18. This made consensual sex, no matter the gender, legal across all 50 states. Continuing on, history takes us to 2013 to the United States v. Windsor case. In this case, Edith Windsor was wed to her wife in Ontario, Canada, but was widowed 2 years later. The two lived in New York, a state that recognized the marriage at the time, but when Windsor sought to claim the federal estate tax exemption, she was barred from doing so. On June 26 of 2013, the court decided that this violated the Constitution and made same-sex marriage recognized federally. Before going on to the next major court case, the next landmark that will be covered is in 2014. In 2014, Tennessee lawmakers passed the Religious Viewpoints Anti-Discrimination Act. Conservative parents began to worry of the potential promotion of homosexual-themed curricula, as said in the Schoolyard Politics Anti-Bullying Journal. By passing this act, and other similar bills in Oklahoma and Michigan, it allowed the free speech of anything religious inside of schools, while also prohibiting the teachings and promotion of anything queer-related. This was called the No Promo Homo, stopping LGBTQ people in history being talked about positively in schools in certain states. These same states were also found to have lower quality and anti-bullying laws. But in the same year, President Barack Obama passed an executive order that prohibited federal contractors from discriminating because of sexual orientation or gender identity. Criticism said that this was redundant, but it clarified murky language that has done damage to the LGBTQ community before. That is the importance of this executive order. 1 year later, in 2015, the Obergefell v. Hodges case took place. Dr. Andrew Weibel told of the significance of this court case. All right. So what is one important piece of legislation that you would say was passed because of queer Americans?
Yeah, I think probably the big, it's not a piece of legislation, but a court case that's important is the Obergefell decision from the Supreme Court that allowed same-sex marriage throughout the country. That was in 2015. Other states, some states had allowed same-sex marriage at that point, but it was not allowed in all the states in the country. And so it was slowly going state to state. Michigan did not have same-sex marriage at the time, and had, in fact, 11 years prior to that, had passed an amendment to the Constitution barring same-sex marriage or civil unions.
Obergefell v. Hodges legalized same-sex marriage across the United States. making all the states issue marriage licenses to queer couples and made each state follow the full faith and credit clause. The same clause that lets a driver's license from Nevada completely legal and recognized in other states around the country. In the same year, November 20th was the most violent transgender day of remembrance Americans had seen since the beginning in 1998. In 2014, sexual orientation hate crimes made up 20.8% of all hate crimes in the United States. Between 2014 and 2015, there were 5,462 transgender deaths, most of which were violently directed towards trans women of color. It is tragic to say that there were 2 years in a row later on that beat that record. June 2016. In Orlando, Florida, at a gay nightclub, a gunman opened fire. The shooter entered the nightclub at 2 a.m., opening fire and holding people hostage until 5:15 a.m. 50 people were killed and 53 were injured, earning this event a spot as one of the deadliest mass shootings in modern U.S. history. 2016. Healthcare and insurance is a difficult service to obtain for many LGBTQ Americans. This was true before 2016 and still holds true today. But in 2016, 8 states filed a lawsuit against the United States Department of Health and Human Services. Their reasoning was that because non-discriminatory protections for LGBTQ Americans existed, it violated doctors' religious beliefs if they had to give their services to them. During the Donald Trump presidency, revisions were made to roll back this non-discriminatory rule, thus not directly taking away, but allowing confusion for thousands of LGBTQ citizens around the country, not privileged enough to live in an area with accepting healthcare providers. Stated from AmericanProgress.org, it would promote discrimination by providers and insurers. The complications of healthcare in queer Americans is nothing new. Patients with HIV were denied medication because they disclosed that they had a same-sex partner. In Michigan, an infant was turned away from a pediatrician's office because she had same-sex parents. Many LGBTQ citizens are unable to find another doctor that would accept them or make them feel comfortable. LGBTQ people are less likely to have health insurance because of a number of circumstances, simply because of an origin that does not accept queer people. And that leads us from the historical events into the events of today. LGBTQ people are widely more accepted in the United States compared to times in the past, but the voices and actions of those who do not favor this minority group are sometimes louder than the marginalized voices themselves. In 2020, sexual orientation-related hate crimes represented 16.7% of all hate crimes. The most violent year for gender nonconforming persons was no longer a title held by 2015, but was beaten by 2020, and 2020 was conquered by 2021. It is also vital to include that these statistics from the FBI are only a fraction of the violence. These are the only ones that were successfully reported. Many of these acts of violence go unnoticed or just simply are not reported. In 2019, former President Donald Trump placed a blanket ban on transgender citizens from serving in the military. This ban would be reversed in 2021 by President Joe Biden. Today, there's a constant struggle, it seems, in relation to the LGBTQ citizens and their rights. But the only way to make an informed and conscious opinion is to educate oneself. Compiled in the following slides are resources anyone can utilize to educate themselves a bit more than this presentation originally did. OutHistory.com is a website for LGBTQ history recording. Its format replicates that of Wikipedia, where there are a number of articles and information contributed by scholars, but any user can contribute as well. It was created with great scrutiny by a group of queer academics. ActUpOralHistory.org is an archive of 187 interviews with members of the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, also known as ACT UP. There are more resources from ACT UP aside from their oral history project. LGBTQmap.org has a plethora of interactive maps with valuable information. As seen on screen, here is a hate crime map. By clicking on the state of Michigan, it brings the user to a page where it goes into detail about Michigan's hate crime laws in relation to the LGBTQ community. Currently, Michigan does not have a hate crime law that covers queer people. QueerUndefined.com is a crowdsourced LGBTQ+ dictionary. This is a site that can help anyone begin the research, lending them a basic explanation of identities and orientations, as well as terms to look into later. Last but not least, thisbrunette.com has a useful guide of LGBTQ flags. This is just the beginning. All that was covered in this presentation only scratches the surface, and with the internet in existence today, anyone can learn beyond the surface. With careful scrutiny and research, LGBTQ+ history can become just as known as other histories. All history exists together. None can be truly extracted alone without some influence from another. Women's history, people of color's history, and LGBTQ+ history is just history, and all needs to be just as known. Thank you for watching.